For today, and perhaps next Wednesday as well, I stumbled upon the most incredible treasure. And I'm going to read the opening sequence so it'll give you the background on it. But the book is called The Poetry Remedy: Prescriptions for the Heart, Mind, and Soul by William Sieghart. An unforgettable green cover. You can't miss it on the shelves. Now, notice there are a few things that have piqued my interest, and you can see how many I've marked. Now, what we're going to do first is read from the introduction. You don't need to be a poet to find solace in poetry. I was 8 years old when I was first sent to boarding school, and I was desperately unhappy. At a time when friends were in short supply, I found that poetry became my friend. Reading it aloud was the only thing I was good at. Oh, I even won a prize or two doing it. That, I think, began my whole relationship with poetry. Since then, these careful crystallizations of feeling, thought, and experience have been a loyal and generous companion to me, even in the most difficult of times. Again and again, in my loneliest hours and in my most tumultuous, I have discovered the greatest solace in finding, reading, and sometimes memorizing the perfect poem for the moment. As a young adult, I was about to cross a road in London when the lights changed. A man standing next to me stepped out into the path of a car and was immediately run down. The suddenness of it all was incredible. The next thing I knew, he was lying on the road, unconscious. Somebody from the crowd was giving him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and had asked for my help, pummeling the poor man's heart back to life. He was lucky. By some incredible fluke, an ambulance was there in a matter of minutes. The man's heart started beating again. The police took my statement, and off he sped, leaving me standing uselessly on the same street corner with the traffic flowing by. Life went on as it had before. The only evidence of this extraordinary drama was my hands, still covered with blood. As I slowly got my breath back, I remembered a poem I'd learned of Philip Larkin's. It's called Ambulances, and it's about the drama and anguish we go through when situations like this arise. How seeing an ambulance brings the dread we feel about the future into greater focus and dulls the distance all we are. Between those apt words and the strong drink I immediately sought out, I was helped to process what had been a bizarre, unexpected, and very disabling 2 hours. Now, that particular poem didn't make it into this book in the end, but what it did for me in that moment points to something much more universal. Like that isolated 8-year-old or that quaking young man, a great many of us turn to poetry in times of need. Above all, when we're grieving, when we're broken-hearted, And when we find ourselves struggling to understand the things we're feeling, we long for the connection poetry can provide. To find the right poem at that crucial moment, one capable of expressing our situation with considerably more elegance than we can ourselves, is to discover a powerful sense of complicity and that precious realization: I'm not the only one who feels like this. In the words of Alan Bennett, I quote, "The best moments in reading are when you come across something, a thought, a feeling, a way of looking at things, which you had thought special and particular to you. Now, here it is, set down by someone else, person you've never met, someone even who is long dead. And it is as if a hand has come out and taken yours. The problem is shared. More than that, very often, it is transformed. The poet has made what you're going through seem more intriguing, more timeless, and more valid in some way. And that can be a great comfort. The distance afforded by seeing one's own emotions formalized and made beautiful combines with the visceral connection one feels with this poet, this stranger who understands. And what results is a sort of peace. This idea that there can be a therapeutic power to a poem is at the heart of the poetry remedy. But that therapeutic power only exists if you can find the right poem for the right state of mind. Now, this book aims to help by gathering poems that I know from experience will help people through most conceivable difficulties of day-to-day life, through the various phases and frustrations of love, grief, work, and all the other concerns that dominate our thoughts. There isn't a singular poem for anything, just as there's no singular human response to an emotion. The first breath of love is very different from the last anguished cries of loss. Love has many moods and many stages, just as do regret and life and solitude. However momentary or enduring it might be, my hope is that you will find a poem within this book that fits your need. Next brief section, and this will be of interest to you. Remember, it's a remarkable book, remarkable in look, remarkable in content, is The History of the Poetry Pharmacy. Now, I've always believed in the power of poetry to explain people to themselves. In this volume, on page 47, is a poem by Stuart Henson called The Price. It's the kind of poem that has enormous impact and power, especially when encountered unexpectedly. More than 20 years ago now, I used to post it around London at the height of the windows in the double-decker buses. I'd put it underneath bridges where I knew buses would have to come by and halt the traffic. It was almost a guerrilla tactic, confronting people with a poem that I knew would startle them, but that I was also confident might help them in some way. Although I didn't think of it that way at the time, that may well have been the first incarnation of what I came to call the poetry pharmacy, the project upon which this book is based. The pharmacy proper began much later, while I was being interviewed at a literary festival in Cornwall, England, about a more traditional anthology I just brought out. A friend of mine, Jenny Dyson, had the idea of allowing me to prescribe poems from the book to audience members after the talk. She set me up in a tent with 2 armchairs and a prescription pad. It turned out to be all that I needed. The hour we had originally planned for came, went, and then a second, and a third, until many hours later, I was still there, with lines of people still waiting for their appointments. I realized that we were on to something. Suffering is the access point to poetry for a lot of people. That's when they, open their ears, hearts, and minds. Being there with the right words for something in that moment when something's happened, when they're in need, is a great comfort, and sometimes creates a love of poetry that can last a lifetime. After Cornwall, I brought the poetry pharmacy to BBC Radio 4. I was asked back to do it again at Christmas, one of the most stressful times of the year, as we all know, and then to BBC television and into the pages of the Guardian newspaper. Meanwhile, I never stopped doing my personal consultations. I toured the country, offering poetry pharmacies in libraries and festivals. In all of this, I learned how much most people's heartaches have in common. The objects and their circumstances might change, but there's nothing like listening to people's problems in leafy Kensington and then a council estate in Liverpool for making you realize the basic spiritual sameness that runs throughout humanity. I must have listened over the last few years to nearly 1,000 people's problems. This book is therefore a compilation of the prescriptions that work for 74 of the problems that really matter. I found that some of my prescriptions, such as the Hafiz poem you'll read about on page 33, so inspire people that they seem to leave their chair a foot taller than when they sat down. Seeing the difference the right poem can make, written on the faces, has given me confidence in poetry's power to change lives. Now, here's a conundrum I've had pushed in my direction many times. Well, okay, I know how to read with a book, but how do I read a poem? Our author takes a stab at this, should give you confidence. People are always telling me that they worry about their ability to read a poem. Oh, they don't really know how to. It's almost as though when they're faced with a poem, they're instantly intimidated, even though, of course, they can read and write like the best of us. When I'm asked for tips, I always give the same advice. Don't read the poem like you would a newspaper or a novel. Read it almost like a prayer. Say it aloud in your head as if you're speaking it to somebody else. Ah, somebody interested who makes you want to perform it properly. Or truly, read it out loud if you want to, and if you're not on the bus. Either way, it's the reading aloud that will allow you to properly hear it, that will make you understand the rhythms, cadences, and musicality of the words and phrases. When people tell me that they don't understand poetry, I have another recommendation. I tell them to read the same poem night after night. Keep it by your bed and read it before you switch out the lights. Read it 5 nights in a row, and you'll find you discover a totally new flavor and feeling from it every time. How you experience a poem depends on your own inner rhythms, on what you've been through and what your mood is that day. But more than that, a really good poem is layered. It uncovers itself bit by bit by bit, never finished, but always rewarding. That's why the joy of a really concise and brilliant poem is that you get more out of it every time. Read the poems in this book however you like. Keep them in your desk drawer for when you feel shaky, or memorize them so you always have them on hand. Read them in a bathtub until the pages are crinkled beyond repair. But however this book works for you, remember that no poem deserves only a single visit. Come back. Try again. Approach them in a new frame of mind or with new openness. If you persevere, you may be surprised at how many new friends you make. Now, look amongst yourselves. Anxiety. Is anyone sitting on the other side of this flick, film, Zoom, Facebook, whatever it is, who has a fear for children, who has a fear of the future, sleeplessness, stress, worrying? The author says, for as long as anxiety has existed, human beings have woken up panicking in the night. And anxiety has existed for a long time. At the very least, since we first became aware of ourselves and of the future, however many millennia ago. Yet it was not until the modern age that anxiety seemed to become an epidemic. Ironically, in a time of great plenty, health, and comfort worldwide than ever before, we are more racked by worry than we have ever been. And no one tells you when you become a parent that you are condemned to worry for the rest of your life. Lying awake at night is usually the worst of all. The blank space of the darkness provides a theater for the most intense and unlikely of worries. putting your sense of powerlessness, of your own vulnerability, and of the vulnerabilities of your loved ones into even sharper perspective. The nighttime is when there is nothing to be done except to brood. These nocturnal concerns are not easy to escape. But I find the calming words of Wendell Berry's "The Peace of Wild Things" help me put things into perspective. Although I live in the middle of a city far away from the wood drake and the great heron, I can see them in my mind's eye when I whisper his words. Perhaps it is the poetic equivalent of counting sheep, but this poem helps me to calm my mind and my breathing and drift into unconsciousness. The poem. The Peace of Wild Things by Wendell Berry. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. Feel better? Okay, now, this one was done for me. The problem is compulsive behavior, also suitable for addiction, obsession, self-destructiveness. And it's a sad fact that when people are having trouble coping, they often turn to solutions even more destructive than their feelings. Whether they struggle with a drug addiction or simply a propensity to pop over to McDonald's after a hard day, I'm constantly speaking to those who no longer feel in control. Now, I also meet people who have suffered at the hands of others' bad habits, or even been subjected to abuse, and who therefore feel that their minds are no longer entirely their own. It can be hard to imagine changing oneself in the face of pressures like this, when you can't envision a world without a destructive habit or thoughts that tear you down. That lack of hope can make it even harder to move on. There's nothing more frightening than feeling trapped in a prison of one's own mind and compulsions. I like the solution offered by these lines by Susan Coolidge because it's straightforward. Okay, they say, things have been bad. Hey, they may be bad again, they may not. In the meantime, Let's take heart with the day. Let's begin again and see what happens. Doesn't need to be dramatic, this change in outlook. It's about acceptance, low-level optimism, and incremental change. There's a wisdom to the way so many of our modern-day mantras focus on living in the moment, relishing the now, smelling the roses. And there's a reason that Alcoholics Anonymous recommends recovery be approached one day at a time. Breaking things down into bite-sized chunks doesn't just make them more manageable, it also provides us with many more chances to start again if we fail. This poem urges us to appreciate the fresh beginnings that every day brings with it. But we don't need to stop there. After all, if tomorrow can be the first day of the rest of your life, why not make this very second its first moment? Now, the piece he referred to, New Every Morning by Susan Coolidge. Every day is a fresh beginning. Listen, my soul, to the glad refrain, and spite of old sorrow and older sinning, and puzzles forecasted and possible pain. Take heart with the day and begin again. Oh, I love this one. This is for depression. Suitable for hopelessness, intractable misery. Whew, I hope none of you feel that. The difficulty with depression is that it can make you believe some very illogical things. Once it has its hooks into you, you can end up feeling like you'll never pull yourself free without unraveling completely. There's no escape, you tell yourself. This is just who you are now. This is how you'll feel from now on. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Time and again in my life and the lives of my patients, I have seen these wonderful, transformative moments that wrench you out of misery and show you the glory of the world as if it were a brand new discovery. You can start the day hopeless and end it knowing that everything is going to be okay. Life can change very, very quickly, often from a source that you never would have expected. I love the sense in this poem of an unfurling of possibility and excitement. Suddenly, happiness is not only plausible, but rushing out of you like a flock of birds in flight, that bowl you over and leave you breathless and laughing. There is a sense of such joy, gratitude, and wonder in this poem that I challenge anyone to read it without experiencing at least an echo of that feeling in themselves. I give this to patients to let them know that they do have something to look forward to. One day soon, the eyes of their eyes will be opened, and they will be able to see the world for what it is, glorious and infinite. And yes, soon, I tell them, this flood of happiness will be yours. And when it happens, you will suddenly know that it was always inevitable. Now, this poem is I Thank You, God, by none other than E. E. Cummings, he of the transformative punctuation. I thank you, God, for this most amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees and a blue true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. I, who have died, am alive again today. And this is the sun's birthday. This is the birthday of life and love and wings and of the gay great happenings illimitably earth. How should tasting, touching, hearing, seeing, breathing, any lifted from the no of nothing, human, merely being, doubt, unimaginable, you? Now the ears of my ears awake, now the eyes of my eyes are open. And in conclusion, the condition is living with difference. This is great if you're feeling isolation, mistrust of others, or prejudice. In a time of discord and division, it can seem all too easy to blame otherness as the root of all our own difficulties. More reason than ever to celebrate the unity of man. When this issue comes up in the poetry pharmacy, I like to point out toward the work of the 14th century Persian poet Hafiz, who wrote in an age when Muslims, Christians, and Jews existed harmoniously alongside one another within a great civilization. We could do with learning how to emulate that today. We all have different ways of going about our lives. We may be Christian or Muslim, vegan or omnivore, artist or stockbroker. Often, these differences can fool us into thinking that we have nothing in common. And yet, it is not only the route we take through life that defines us. No less important is the destination toward which we aim. Wherever or whomever we worship, whatever our moral code or our profession, we are probably working toward the same goal as someone who might seem to be our polar opposite. Fundamentally, we all want many of the same things: to live a good life, to feel happy, safe, and loved, and most of all, to be able to see ourselves as good people, to be able to live with ourselves. There is a sense these days that otherness is somehow suspicious. But the fact that somebody prays on a different day, eats different food, or dresses in a different style should be a source of curiosity and an opportunity to learn more about our shared humanity, not cause for fear and mistrust. After all, as Hafiz suggests in this poem, the way in which we choose to achieve something may finally be of no great consequence, so long as we all end up in what? Taking the longer view. Turns out to be much the same place. This is I Am in Love with Every Church by Hafiz, translated by Daniel Ladinsky. I am in love with every church and mosque and temple and any kind of shrine, because I know it is there that people say the different names of the one God. And so we end today's journey with poetry, and I will give you a little heads up. I hope to read from that same book again next Wednesday. But Friday, you ever seen a moth or a butterfly? Well, we're going to go into storytelling heaven with a book of stories from the moth. Until then, until Friday, take care.